I always imagined what it would be like to find something that could change the course of history, something that would make me feel connected to a past long gone, yet still alive in the ruins and mysteries left behind. As an archaeologist, that was my dream. However, nothing could have prepared me for what was about to happen. My name is Lisa Harper, and I'm an American archaeologist, fascinated by ancient Egypt for as long as I can remember. My obsession began in childhood. During the afternoons, I spent flipping through old books in the library of my small town in New Mexico. I would lose myself in the pages that spoke of pharaohs, queens, monuments, and secrets buried in the sands for millennia. Now, as an adult living my dream, I never imagined that fate would lead me back to Egypt on one of the most mysterious and dangerous expeditions of my career. It all began on a sweltering March morning when I received an unexpected email from Professor Richard Beaumont, a world-renowned Egyptologist. Beaumont was practically a living legend in the field of archaeology. He had led significant discoveries in the Valley of the Kings, unearthing artifacts that changed our understanding of the reigns of Tutankhamun and Ramses. His invitation to join his latest expedition felt surreal. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity," the email said in short, concise sentences. The message contained few details, only that he had found a mysterious map and needed a specialized team. The map apparently indicated the location of a lost tomb in the desert. It was said to belong to a nearly forgotten pharaoh named Neferkhamon, who ruled during a brief and turbulent period marked by dark magic and internal wars. Many historians didn't even recognize his name, but local legends spoke of his curse. I knew this was my chance, an opportunity to be part of something bigger, something that could resonate through the ages. At the same time, I couldn't shake a slight feeling of dread. Beaumont was known for taking risks, and according to some colleagues, he believed in occult forces and ancient Egyptian magic. I, on the other hand, had always been a skeptic. To me, curses were just myths, stories people told to keep the curious away from the tombs. Despite my doubts, I accepted. 2 months later, I landed in Cairo. The dry, relentless desert heat hit me the moment I left the airport. The air seemed to hum around me, filled with dust and history. As the taxi weaved through the congested streets toward the hotel, I watched the people, the buildings, and the distant horizon, where the pyramids loomed like distant phantoms, witnesses to a civilization long gone, but still commanding our imagination. When I arrived at the hotel, I was greeted by Beaumont himself. He was exactly as I had imagined, tall, with a commanding presence, silver hair, and eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface. There was something unsettling about him, a kind of hidden energy, as if he was always on the verge of uncovering something only he understood.
Lisa Harper,
He said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes.
finally the young archaeologist I've heard so much about. I hope you're ready for what's to come.
I nodded, though his greeting left a strange sensation in the air. Standing next to him was another man, Daniel Carter, his assistant and second in command on the expedition. Daniel was young, maybe just a few years older than me, but he carried an air of mystery. His blue eyes were intense, and there was something about his demeanor that intrigued me from the very beginning. He didn't say much, just observed with a quiet, unsettling calm. After introductions, Beaumont gathered us in the hotel conference room for a briefing. The table was covered with papers, aerial photos, and a copy of the ancient map. He began telling us the story of Neferkhamon, a pharaoh who ruled during a period of instability in Egypt. According to some legends, he was erased from history, his statues destroyed, and his name removed from all records. There was almost nothing about him in the books, except for vague references in forgotten temple texts.
This pharaoh, Neferkhamon, is shrouded in mystery.
Beaumont said, pointing to the map at the center of the table.
It is believed he made a pact with the dark gods to extend his life. There are stories of black magic, human sacrifices, and secret cults. For centuries, he was erased from history until we found this.
He held up a small stone figurine. It was the figure of a pharaoh, but the face was worn, as if deliberately ruined. Around it, There were inscriptions that Beaumont said confirmed the location of his tomb.
Tomorrow we head to the desert. The site is days away from any town in a region no one has dared to explore. If we succeed, Lisa, we'll make history.
The next morning, at the first light of dawn, we set out. We traveled by jeep to the desert's edge, where a caravan of camels awaited us for the final stretch of the journey. The hot, stinging desert wind blew relentlessly, carrying with it grains of sand that seemed to infiltrate everything. I felt small in the vast golden landscape, but determined. As the days passed, and we got closer to the location indicated on the map, the terrain became more hostile. The dunes seemed to shift strangely, as if something beneath the surface was alive, watching. The silence, often interrupted only by the whisper of the wind, was almost deafening. At night, the cold was brutal, and the stars shone with an intensity I had never seen before. The night before we reached the excavation site, I sat by the fire while the rest of the team rested in their tents. Daniel was sitting some distance away, staring at the dark horizon. I felt an inexplicable pull toward him, as if we were connected by some invisible thread. But at the same time, there was something about him that unsettled me, like he knew more than he was letting on. He came over and sat next to me. "What do you think we'll find tomorrow?" I asked, trying to break the silence. He was quiet for a moment, gazing up at the starry sky before answering.
"I don't know, but I feel it won't just be an archaeological discovery. There's something different about this place.
Different how?
Like we're being watched, like something is waiting for us."
His words sent a chill down my spine. I tried to laugh, but it came out forced. It was hard to ignore the growing sense that we were heading towards something dangerous, something we might not be able to control. The next day, we found what we were looking for. During the initial excavation, an opening was revealed, buried under centuries of sand. The excitement among the team was immediate. Beaumont was ecstatic. He knew we were about to unearth one of Egypt's greatest secrets. When we finally cleared away the last layer of sand, a large stone door was revealed. It was adorned with hieroglyphs, worn by time but still legible. I stepped closer, running my fingers over the inscriptions, trying to decipher them. "Those who disturb the slumber of Neferkhamon will bring darkness upon themselves and all who follow. His spirit will awaken, and there will be no escape from the curse." A chill ran down my spine. We'd read stories of curses before, but something about these words felt different, more real, more threatening. I looked over at Daniel, who was standing beside me. His face was serious, his eyes fixed on the inscriptions. "Do you believe in curses?" I asked, trying to mask the discomfort in my voice. He hesitated for a moment before replying.
"It's not about belief sometimes, Lisa. What's buried should stay buried."
With the door open, we were about to enter Neferkhamon's tomb. Little did we know that by crossing that threshold, we were unleashing something far older and more terrifying than any of us could have imagined. The desert heat was unlike anything I had imagined. Of course, I knew it would be hot. Every account said so. But I wasn't prepared for the dry, relentless air that burned my lungs with every breath. It was a heat that drained your energy, leaving behind a vulnerability I had never felt before. The shifting dunes seemed to swallow us as we moved deeper into Egypt's heart. Each grain of sand clung to my skin and clothes, as if trying to make me a part of the endless vastness. It was hard not to feel insignificant there, as though time was a distant concept while the desert remained unchanged, a silent witness to millennia of buried secrets. The landscape around us was eerily inhospitable, as if nothing could ever survive here, except perhaps the ancients who, in some way, still ruled this barren land of dust and stone. The merciless sun was about to disappear behind the dunes when we finally saw the spot where we would set up camp near the tomb we had discovered days earlier. The team was exhausted, and the Egyptian workers still murmured about the inscription we had found at the entrance of the tomb. The curse. Even though few openly believed the words written there, the idea that we had awakened something ancient hung over us like a shadow. As the tents were being set up, an uncomfortable silence settled over the camp. Normally, a new discovery would be cause for celebration. Stories and laughter were common in such moments, but not this time. The excitement from the first hours of excavation had been replaced by the sense that we had ventured too far, that this discovery carried an invisible burden. I glanced at Daniel, who was helping unload the excavation equipment. He said nothing, but his deep-set eyes conveyed that he too felt the weight of the atmosphere. Once the camp was established, I headed to the central tent where Daniel and Beaumont were discussing the next steps of the expedition. Upon entering, I noticed tension in the air, something uncommon between them. Daniel was standing, focused on a map, with sketches of the hieroglyphs we had copied from the tombs scattered across the table. His normally calm and analytical eyes now seemed disturbed, as if he had understood something the others had not yet grasped.
These symbols,
he said, pointing to one of the detailed sketches we had made of the tomb's inscriptions.
they aren't just there as a symbolic warning. They're a containment spell. Something very old and very powerful was placed in this tomb, and those who buried it wanted to ensure it would never be released.
His voice was steady but laden with concern. Beaumont shook his head, impatient, clearly annoyed by Daniel's serious tone.
Daniel, you're overreacting. This is a tomb like any other, and you know it. We need to continue with the excavation. We can't let ourselves be intimidated by superstitions. What we found here is too important to set aside because of old stories,
he said, scanning the documents as if trying to minimize what lay before us. Yet Daniel's words echoed in my mind. Something about the way he spoke and the intensity in his eyes made my stomach churn. I too felt that something was deeply wrong. The weight of the curse written on the walls seemed more than just a superstitious warning. There was a purpose to those words. Someone, or something, wanted to ensure it was never disturbed. Night quickly fell over the desert, and with it came the rising strength of the winds. The sand swirled around us, as if the desert itself were conspiring, creating shapes and shadows in the light cast by the campfire. It was a darker night than usual, and everyone seemed uneasy. After a simple dinner, we gathered around the fire. The workers were visibly tense, and Ali, one of the oldest and most respected among them, began to tell stories. His deep, serious voice was like a forewarning of what was to come. "They say there are tombs that hold more than gold and glory," he began, his dark eyes reflecting the flames dancing in the fire. "They guard cursed souls, kings who defied the gods and were punished with a fate worse than death. Waking them is like opening a door to a forgotten hell." The silence around the fire deepened. Ali's words were steeped in mystery and superstition, but they didn't sound like ordinary tales. It was as if he were revealing a hidden truth, something that could not be undone. His eyes scanned the group, each of us quiet, captivated by the power of his narrative. I glanced at Daniel, expecting a skeptical remark or a joke to break the tension, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed on the flames, his expression as dark as the night surrounding us. "Perhaps we should be cautious," I suggested, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. "We don't know what we might really find down there." Daniel finally lifted his gaze and stared at me for a moment. His look was intense, as if he carried ancient wisdom, something beyond his scientific understanding.
There are forces in this world, Lisa, that can't be explained. I believe we're dealing with something beyond what we can comprehend.
His words hit me like a punch to the gut. All my life I had been taught to view the world rationally, to seek answers in science and history. But in that moment, next to Daniel, in the middle of an inhospitable desert, it felt as though everything I knew was crumbling. Worse yet, I felt something terrible was about to be revealed. The wind howled around us, lifting swirls of sand, while the fire cast distorted shadows that seemed to dance along with Ali's words. The desert was alive that night, as if it had been listening to our conversation, as if it knew we had uncovered something we shouldn't have. As the night wore on, everyone dispersed to their tents, but I couldn't settle. Daniel and Ali's words echoed in my mind, and a sense of unease settled over me. I lay down in my tent, trying to push away the worries plaguing me, but as the darkness grew deeper, I felt something, a presence. Someone, or something, was watching. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the weight of that sensation was impossible to ignore. The following days were filled with discoveries, but each new finding seemed to bring more questions than answers. We continued digging around the entrance to the tomb, uncovering more symbols and inscriptions. The hieroglyphs were unusual, different from anything we had seen in other tombs. They spoke of a pharaoh who had been forgotten by the gods and a dark power that rested with him. Beaumont, ever the skeptic, insisted we push on. He was obsessed with the discovery, and nothing would make him stop. However, Daniel and I felt something different. Each step forward felt like a violation. It was as though we were venturing into forbidden territory, meddling with forces we couldn't fully comprehend. That afternoon, we found something that made my heart race. A hidden passage, buried under tons of sand, was discovered by one of the workers. The inscriptions around the entrance were clear. "Here lies he who defied death. Do not disturb his slumber, or his wrath will devour the living." Daniel and I exchanged glances. The air around us felt heavier, as if something was surrounding us, pressing in. A chill ran down my spine despite the suffocating heat. "Should we go in?" I asked hesitantly, my voice barely a whisper. Daniel took a deep breath, his face grim but resolute.
We've come this far. We can't turn back now, but we must be careful. We're dealing with something ancient, something dangerous.
Beaumont, however, was too excited to consider caution. He gave the order to open the passage, ignoring the nervous looks from the workers. Ali, normally one of the bravest, refused to approach. His face was pale and his eyes filled with terror. "This place, it's not for the living," he muttered, crossing his arms over his chest in a gesture of protection. "If you continue, you are doomed." But Beaumont wasn't listening. His obsession with success, with the glory of a unique discovery, had already clouded his judgment. He was willing to do anything to open that tomb. Finally, after hours of hard work under the blazing sun, we managed to remove the stones sealing the passage. The darkness that emerged from the opening was thick, almost tangible, as if the air inside the tomb had been dead for millennia. The smell of ancient dust and something else, something I couldn't identify, filled the air. We lit our lanterns and began descending the staircase leading into the depths of the tomb. Each step echoed as if we were entering a massive cavern. The walls around us were covered in hieroglyphs, but now the words seemed more chaotic, almost desperate. It was as if the scribes who carved them had been overcome with fear as they worked. The silence was oppressive. None of us spoke, and the only thing I could hear was my own quickened breath and the sound of our footsteps echoing in the void. Suddenly, Daniel stopped. His lantern illuminated a large stone door before us. The hieroglyphs engraved on it were unlike anything we had seen. They were menacing, as if warning us of a terrible fate.
This is the point of no return.
Daniel murmured, his eyes fixed on the door.
If we cross this threshold, there's no going back.
The chill in my spine deepened. We knew we were about to open something that shouldn't be opened, but the curiosity and the allure of the mystery were stronger than the fear. Beaumont, already impatient, stepped forward and began examining the door, looking for a mechanism to open it. He was blind to the dangers, driven by the desire to be the first to reveal the secrets of this tomb. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. And that's when everything began to unravel. The wind blew relentlessly as the team worked, raising clouds of sand that seemed to swallow everything around us. Since we arrived at the excavation site, a silent unease had lingered, as if the desert itself were watching, patiently waiting for us to cross an invisible boundary. Despite the scorching heat and mounting exhaustion, the group worked with precision, and Richard Beaumont's determination to open the tomb was infectious. Daniel and I spent our days studying the hieroglyphs on the surrounding rocks. There was something peculiar about them, something I couldn't fully decipher, but that left me unsettled. They spoke of power, forgotten kings, and pacts with dark gods. Between every line, every symbol, I felt a warning growing stronger by the day. It was on the 5th morning of the excavation that we found what we were looking for. Ali, one of the Egyptian workers, was removing a thick layer of sand when his shovel struck something solid. The sound of metal against stone was muffled by the wind, but enough to catch our attention. We rushed over to him, and soon we were all kneeling, clearing the sand around the discovery. Beaumont, eager as ever, directed every move. The entrance to the tomb was partially buried. A massive stone slab, covered in hieroglyphs that seemed to have withstood time, rested over a deep opening. As we cleared more sand, the symbols became clear, and my heart sank. It was a warning. He who awakens the Pharaoh shall be consumed by time and eternal darkness. I glanced at Daniel. His eyes were fixed on the inscriptions, his expression tense. He read aloud in a low voice, as if trying to grasp something beyond the words. For a moment, I thought he might suggest we stop, that perhaps it was better to leave this buried. But instead, he just sighed and gave me a firm look.
It seems we've found what we came for.
Or he found us, I thought. Beaumont, of course, was elated. To him, the warning was nothing more than an ancient superstition, part of the macabre theater Pharaohs often orchestrated to ward off tomb robbers. He immediately began organizing the team to remove the slab and open the tomb. Yet something about that phrase stuck with me. I knew Egypt was filled with curses and stories of vengeful spirits. Over the years, I had read many accounts of archaeologists who met their fate at the hands of forces they couldn't explain. My heart raced, but when I looked at Daniel, I saw that he shared the same restless curiosity that drove me, and I couldn't deny it. Part of me was fascinated by the danger. With great effort, the team managed to remove the stone slab. When the last layer of sand was brushed away, the entrance to the tomb was revealed. It was a dark crevice that seemed to plunge deep into the earth, like the mouth of a sleeping monster. The air that wafted from it was cold, despite the desert heat, and had a strange smell, as if time itself had been frozen for millennia. Beaumont was impatient, like a child who had just opened a present, and he could barely wait to go inside. But there were procedures to follow. We needed to make a preliminary assessment to ensure the structure was stable. Still, I knew no preparation could brace us for what we might find down there. While we waited for the right moment to enter, I examined the hieroglyphs around the entrance more closely. One phrase repeated itself several times. Neferkhamon, Lord of the Night, he who controls time and eternity. The more I read, the more I felt a growing discomfort. Neferkhamon wasn't just any pharaoh. He seemed to be someone deeply involved in practices that transcended death.
You all right?
Daniel asked, interrupting my thoughts. I took a deep breath, trying to push away the unease. I think so. I just can't get this curse out of my head. They mention it everywhere. It's as if they're begging people not to enter. He nodded, but didn't seem worried.
We're about to violate something that's been untouched for thousands of years, Lisa. Of course, there would have been measures to scare off intruders. But in the end, they're just words.
I wanted to believe that, but something in me couldn't ignore the warning. Finally, by late afternoon, the moment we had all been waiting for arrived. We were ready to enter the tomb. The group was small, just the key members of the team. Myself, Daniel, Beaumont, and 2 experienced workers, Ali and Karim. Beaumont, of course, was the first to go in, holding a powerful flashlight that illuminated the tunnel ahead of us. I followed close behind, with Daniel by my side and the others trailing behind. The tunnel was narrow and suffocating, with walls covered in hieroglyphs and symbols that became more complex as we descended. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the sound of our footsteps and the occasional heavy breath from a member of the team. With each step, I could feel the weight of accumulated time pressing in on us. The darkness seemed to have a life of its own, as if the shadows were watching our every move. The walls around us felt closer, and the air grew thicker. It wasn't just the air that had changed. There was a presence here. I couldn't explain it, but something felt wrong. That's when we heard the first scream. Ali, who was right behind me, let out a sharp, piercing scream. We turned to see him clutching his chest, his face pale with terror. He was staring intently at something we couldn't see. We rushed to him, but before we could understand what was happening, he collapsed, convulsing on the ground.
What's happening?
Beaumont shouted, trying to maintain control, though fear was evident in his voice. Karim knelt beside Ali, desperate to help, but there was nothing we could do. In minutes, he was dead. His eyes were open, but empty, as if his soul had been ripped from his body. The silence that followed was terrifying. We all stood there, frozen, not knowing what to do. Daniel was the first to regain composure.
We need to get out of here. This isn't normal.
I wanted to agree with him, wanted to run out of that tomb and never return. But Beaumont, stubborn as always, refused to accept the reality before us.
It's a coincidence.
He insisted, though his eyes betrayed the fear he was trying to hide.
We can't let a tragic death stop us. We're so close.
This isn't a coincidence, Richard. This is a warning.
Beaumont shook his head, clearly torn between terror and ambition.
I can't just stop now. If we're right, this discovery will change everything we know about ancient Egypt. You don't understand.
I looked down at Ali, his lifeless body on the tomb floor, and knew that, somehow, this was only the beginning. Something was happening here, something far beyond us. Richard, we need to leave, at least for today, I suggested, trying to sound calm despite the growing panic inside me. But Beaumont wouldn't budge. He was determined to press on, even if it meant losing more people. Daniel, realizing we wouldn't be able to convince him, leaned closer to me and whispered,
Let's take a break, but stay alert, Lisa. Something's very wrong here, and I don't want us to be next.
With Ali's body removed to the surface, the group decided we would continue the next day, after a night of rest. But rest didn't come for me. Lying in my tent, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about what we had found in that tomb. The desert, which once seemed so vast and imposing, now felt suffocating, as if the sands themselves were closing in on us. I knew I couldn't avoid what was coming. The tomb had been opened, and something had been released with it. The curse wasn't just a superstition, something that could be ignored. It was alive. And we were all doomed to find out what that meant. The desert air felt heavier that night. Normally, the temperature would drop drastically after sunset, but it remained surprisingly high. Inside my tent, the heat was suffocating, but it wasn't just the weather that bothered me. The image of Ali, dead with his eyes open in a haunting emptiness, lingered in my mind. Even though only a few hours had passed since the tragic incident, it felt as if an invisible weight had fallen upon the entire expedition. I turned on the makeshift bed for the 1,000th time, unable to find any rest. The wind outside howled irregularly, as if something was moving through the dunes. Every small sound heightened my senses, my adrenaline spiking along with the fear. What had we unleashed in that tomb? I closed my eyes, trying to calm my mind. But as soon as my eyelids grew heavy, I was transported to another place. I was no longer in the heat of the Egyptian desert, nor in the relative safety of my tent. I was inside the tomb. The walls around me glowed with an ethereal light, a color I couldn't quite identify, something between gold and purple, pulsing as if it were alive. The silence was deafening. The air was cold and dense, the opposite of the reality I knew. It felt as though time and space had been distorted. My feet moved without my consent, as if something was guiding me deeper into this labyrinthine structure. The hieroglyphs on the walls seemed to shimmer with a strange energy, dancing before my eyes. I knew it was a dream, or at least it seemed like one, but everything felt disturbingly real. Suddenly, the darkness around me began to shift. Shadows stretched across the walls, contorting into strange shapes. And then, from the darkness, a figure started to take form. It was a tall man, dressed in royal garments. His skin had a grayish hue, and his eyes were like black holes, absorbing all the light around them. His presence was overwhelming, and the air grew heavier, as if the tomb itself was alive, breathing in rhythm with him. Neferkhamon. I knew it was him, even though I had never seen him before. Every part of my body screamed for me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in his presence. He approached slowly, his feet seeming to hover above the ground. When he was just inches from me, he lowered himself slightly until his face was level with mine. The stench of death filled the air. He whispered something, but the words were incomprehensible, an ancient language my ears couldn't recognize. Yet I felt the intent behind them. He was summoning me. My eyes widened as his lips formed one last sound. Then, his cold hand touched my forehead, and a wave of pain shot through my mind, as if he were planting something inside me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My vision blurred, and I was swallowed by darkness. I awoke gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat. The tent around me was dark, but the sensation of Neferkhamon's touch still burned on my skin. My hands trembled, and my mind struggled to process what had just happened. Was it just a dream? No, it was more than that. It had been real, in a way I couldn't explain. It felt as though he had entered my mind, leaving an indelible mark. I stood quickly, my knees shaky. I needed to get out of the tent, needed air. As I unzipped the entrance, I was met by the eerie silence of the desert. The night was cold now, as it should be, but the wind blew unsettlingly, as if the desert itself was whispering secrets I couldn't understand. In the distance, I saw a faint light near the entrance to the tomb. Someone was there. My heart raced. Despite the fear still swirling in my thoughts, something inside me pushed me toward the light. What else could I discover that night? As I approached the light, I recognized the figure standing at the tomb's entrance. Daniel. He stood there, staring intently at the entrance, as though something had called him there, just as I had been drawn by my vision. The lantern in his hands swayed gently as he kept his eyes fixed on the darkness. Daniel? My voice came out quieter than I intended. It felt wrong to break the profound silence of the night. He didn't turn immediately. When he finally did, there was something different in his eyes. His normally sharp and curious gaze was now vacant, as though he was trapped somewhere far beyond the reach of reality. His face was pale, almost translucent in the lantern's light.
Lisa.
His voice seemed distant, as though he were speaking to me from another world. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to hide the urgency in my voice. He seemed lost, and that worried me more than anything. He shrugged, his eyes drifting back to the entrance of the tomb.
I don't know. Something brought me here. I had to come.
I stepped closer, feeling the tension grow in my stomach. Daniel had always been so composed, so grounded, but now he seemed to be unraveling under some invisible weight. "Daniel, are you okay?" I touched his arm, hoping to pull him back to reality. For a moment, he looked into my eyes, and I thought I saw a flicker of something familiar, but it was brief. He turned again to the tomb, his eyes locked on some invisible point in the darkness.
You feel it, don't you? There's something here, something that doesn't want us here, but at the same time needs us.
A chill ran down my spine. His words were dangerously close to what I had been feeling myself. Whatever was inside that tomb, whatever Neferkhamon was, it wasn't just a threat. It was a summons. "You're talking about Neferkhamon?" My voice trembled slightly. "I had a dream, a vision. I saw him." Daniel finally turned to look at me fully. His eyes were more focused now, but there was a darkness in them that hadn't been there before. A shadow that followed him.
It wasn't a dream, Lisa.
He hesitated, as if deciding how much to tell me.
I saw him too. He spoke to me.
The shock ran through me. The idea that Daniel had experienced something similar made me feel less alone, but at the same time, it intensified the fear I felt. What did this mean? Why were both of us connected to this ancient and malevolent presence? "Did he say something?" I asked, my voice low, almost a whisper. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to remember.
Yes, but I can't fully understand it. It was an ancient language. He talked about time, about eternity, and there was a feeling like he wanted something from me, from us.
A wave of panic washed over me. Time, eternity. The words from the hieroglyphs echoed in my mind. "He who awakens the Pharaoh shall be consumed by time and eternal darkness." We were playing with forces we didn't understand, and it was starting to consume us. The desert, the tomb, Neferkhamon. Everything seemed part of a larger plan, a plan that now entangled us, whether we wanted it or not. "We need to stop, Daniel." My voice was urgent now. "We can't keep going with this. Something is very wrong." But Daniel didn't seem to hear me. He was entranced by the entrance to the tomb, his eyes fixed on the darkness.
It's too late to stop, Lisa. He's awake, and he won't stop until he gets what he wants.
In the hours that followed, I returned to my tent, trying to process what had happened. I knew Daniel was right, but at the same time, I didn't want to believe it. Everything inside me screamed to run, to abandon the expedition and never look back. But there was a part of me, a growing part, that couldn't ignore the curiosity. Neferkhamon had entered my dreams, my mind, and now I couldn't escape the desire to understand what he wanted. But the night brought no answers, only more questions. Sleep had become impossible, and the darkness felt heavier, more oppressive than ever. Every sound in the desert felt like a warning, every breeze a whisper of something coming our way. The next day, when the team gathered to resume the work, Daniel was strangely quiet. His hands trembled slightly, and his eyes were sunken, as though he hadn't slept. He avoided looking directly at me, but I could feel his presence from a distance, as if we were connected somehow by what we had both experienced the night before. Beaumont, of course, remained blind to the changes happening around him. His obsession with the tomb blinded him to what was unfolding. He commanded the team with the same determination, unaware of the growing nervousness among the workers, their hesitation, the fearful glances they exchanged. As we began preparing to descend once more into the tomb, a part of me knew that we had already crossed the line. There was no turning back now. Neferkhamon was awake. Descending once more into Neferkhamon's tomb didn't feel like a conscious choice. Something greater than us was pulling us in, an invisible force that, while terrifying, carried with it an inexplicable allure. There was a mixture of fear and fascination surrounding us as we prepared for what promised to be the most significant discovery of our lives, and perhaps the most deadly. The desert was silent as we gathered around the tomb's entrance. The dry air whistled softly, as if the desert itself were warning us not to return. But no one said anything. The death of Ali, though still fresh in everyone's mind, had been brushed aside by Beaumont's ambition. He refused to retreat. To him, one man's fate was insignificant compared to the magnitude of what we were about to uncover. Daniel and I walked side by side toward the dark entrance. He was quieter than usual, which made me uneasy. Since the night before, Something had changed in him. He was more distant, more introspective. His eyes, which had once been sharp and observant, were now shadowed, as though something was pulling him inward. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to mask the concern in my voice. He glanced at me quickly but didn't answer immediately. His gaze returned to the tomb's darkness, as though he were listening to a call only he could hear.
I think so, Lina. It's just a strange feeling, like something is pulling me down there. I don't know how to explain it.
I knew exactly what he was feeling. Ever since my vision, the idea of entering the tomb again had become irresistible, despite the fear that came with it. We descended slowly through the narrow, dark tunnel, illuminated only by the flickering lanterns in our hands. The walls were the same as before, covered in hieroglyphs that seemed to come alive under the faint light. Every symbol seemed to whisper a warning, a distant echo of a forgotten curse. After walking for what felt like an eternity, we finally arrived in a vast underground chamber. It was enormous, with high ceilings that disappeared into the darkness. At the center of the room stood a massive stone structure, Neferkhamon's sarcophagus. My heart raced. There it was, the tomb of the cursed pharaoh. We were so close to a monumental discovery, yet something inside me screamed for us to leave. Something was terribly wrong, and I knew that breaking the seal on the sarcophagus would only make things worse.
This is it.
Beaumont whispered, his voice filled with awe.
The final resting place of Neferkhamon. We've made history.
The sarcophagus was immense, carved from a single block of dark stone, with inscriptions that seemed to glow under our lanterns. A figure was etched onto the lid, the image of Neferkhamon in repose, his hands crossed over his chest, holding a scepter and an ankh, symbols of power and eternal life. But what drew our attention the most was the seal that kept the sarcophagus closed. It was a golden amulet, affixed at the center of the lid. The symbol engraved on it was a circle bisected by a line, and I recognized it immediately. It was the symbol of eternal time, an ancient representation of cycles that never end. A chill ran down my spine. This seal wasn't just decorative. It had a purpose. It was there to keep something trapped.
We need to remove this carefully,
Beaumont said, stepping forward, his excitement evident. Daniel approached the sarcophagus, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared to touch the amulet. I wanted to protest, the fear inside me growing, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if something was holding me back, an invisible force that silenced me. With careful hands, Daniel grasped the amulet and pulled it free. For a moment, everything was silent. And then, everything changed. A cold wind, impossible in the scorching desert, blew from within the sarcophagus. The lantern lights began to flicker, and the temperature plummeted. A deep, almost mournful sound echoed through the chamber. The shadows around us started to writhe, taking on shapes that seemed human, but twisted. It was as if the darkness itself had come alive, moving in waves around us. I felt a crushing pressure in my head, as if something was trying to invade my mind. Visions began to flash before me. I saw Neferkhamon on his throne, surrounded by his subjects. He raised his hands, and time around him twisted, turning everything to dust. He was the Lord of time and death, and his power was absolute. Suddenly, Daniel screamed. I turned to see him stumble back, his hands pressed to his temples. He fell to his knees, his eyes wide with terror, as though he were witnessing something too horrific to comprehend.
He is here.
Daniel whispered, his voice broken with fear. Beaumont, however, did not back away. He stepped forward to the sarcophagus and, with the help of 2 workers, began to push the lid open. The sound of stone grinding against stone echoed through the chamber as the heavy lid slowly moved. That's when everything fell apart. Karim, one of the workers helping to push the lid, suddenly screamed. He fell backward, his body convulsing violently as if being attacked by something invisible. His eyes were wide, and he screamed in agony, clutching his chest as if his heart were about to explode. The others shouted and rushed to help him, but before anyone could reach him, he was dead. His body lay still, his mouth open in a silent scream. Beaumont stood frozen for a moment, horror etched on his face, but his ambition would not allow him to retreat. He took a step forward, determined to open the sarcophagus no matter the cost. When the lid was finally removed entirely, a wave of rotten air filled the room, as though Neferkhamon's very body exhaled the death it had accumulated over millennia. The atmosphere in the chamber grew even heavier, making it hard to breathe. The pharaoh's body lay inside the sarcophagus, wrapped in ancient cloths that were surprisingly well preserved. His face was covered by a golden mask, and in his hands, he held a strange artifact, a small sculpture of a scarab beetle carved from obsidian. My mind spun. We knew we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding. I moved closer to the sarcophagus, unable to contain my curiosity. Something about the scarab seemed important. A key, perhaps. But a key to what? Daniel, still panting, managed to stand and approach, his eyes fixed on the artifact.
This is the center of everything,
he murmured, as if under a trance. I wanted to touch it, but something held me back. Instinct told me that this artifact was more than just a burial object. It was the key to the curse, to Neferkhamon's power. If we touched it, if we interfered further, the curse would manifest in ways we couldn't control. Suddenly, the shadows on the walls began to move again, but this time more aggressively. They were no longer just indistinct figures. They had form, and they were coming toward us. "We need to get out of here!" I screamed, panic overtaking me. Beaumont, finally aware of the terror he had unleashed, looked around, but his reaction was too late. The shadows were closing in, as if they were creatures that had been freed after centuries of confinement. We ran toward the exit, the cold wind and ghostly whispers chasing us. But as we fled from the sarcophagus, the feeling that something terrible had been unleashed followed each of us, something that could no longer be contained. Outside, the desert was unnervingly quiet, as if it were patiently waiting for the events to unfold. Daniel sat in the sand, gasping for breath, his eyes still wide and vacant, as though his mind was far away, trying to process what had happened. Beaumont, on the other hand, was stunned, but still obsessed. Even in the face of overwhelming supernatural evidence, his ambition clouded his judgment.
"This is everything,"
he muttered to himself, as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. I knew that the obsidian scarab was the key to the curse, but we had no idea how to use it, or whether we should even try. One thing was clear: we had broken the seal, and Neferkhamon's curse was loose. Night was falling quickly, and I knew the true terror was yet to come. The silence of the desert was shattered the next morning by the shrill scream of one of the workers. When I rushed out of my tent, heart pounding and my mind still foggy from the previous night's events, I was met with a horrifying sight. Ahmed, one of the workers who had helped open the sarcophagus, lay twisted in the sand, his body contorted in a grotesque position. His eyes were wide open, but lifeless. There was no sign of external violence, but his face was frozen in an expression of pure terror. "What's happening?" I asked aloud, my breath shallow and irregular. No one answered. Everyone was in shock. Daniel was the first to kneel beside Ahmed, examining the body with an almost automatic precision. But there was something in his eyes, a dark understanding that this was only the beginning. He didn't look at me, but his voice came out hoarse and strained.
He died of fear. Look at his eyes. It's as if he saw something beyond description.
I swallowed hard, my thoughts scattered. The shadows from the previous night, the visions, the cold wind that carried whispers from another world. It all rushed back into my mind. It was as if the curse had been released, now circling us, hunting for its first victims. Beaumont, on the other hand, seemed less concerned with Ahmed's death than he should have been. He paced in circles, his eyes fixed on the obsidian scarab that he still held. With every moment, his expression grew more disturbed, but not with fear, with obsession.
We can't stop now.
He muttered to himself, as if trying to justify his own madness.
We're so close to discovering everything.
No one replied. What had happened to Karim was just the prelude of what was to come, and we all knew the situation would only get worse. In the hours that followed, we tried to regroup. The workers were clearly terrified, murmuring about curses and vengeful gods. Many wanted to leave, to abandon the expedition immediately. Mahmoud, who had lost his friend Ahmed, glared directly at Beaumont, his eyes filled with both fear and anger. You brought us here to die. This tomb should have remained sealed. You have released the curse, and now it will hunt us all, one by one. Beaumont, of course, refused to acknowledge the gravity of the situation. His response was cold, almost devoid of emotion.
We are dealing with phenomena we don't yet understand. Ahmed's death, as tragic as it is, cannot be attributed to a superstitious curse. We will continue the work and ensure this discovery is not in vain.
The workers murmured amongst themselves, and I could see the growing fear in their eyes. None of Beaumont's words could dispel the terror they felt. For them, this was no longer an excavation. It was a death trap. Later, as night began to fall once again, the atmosphere grew even heavier. The wind had stopped, leaving the camp in an absolute silence that only heightened the sense that something was watching us. I sat outside my tent, trying to process everything that had happened. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to leave this place. Yet something held me there, a mixture of fascination and fear. I couldn't leave. It was as if Neferkhamon's presence had seeped into me, trapping me in his web. Daniel approached quietly and sat beside me. He looked exhausted. His shoulders slumped under the weight of everything we had been through. But there was also an invisible connection between us, something that had grown since the previous night when we had both felt Neferkhamon's presence. It was as if we were bound by this curse.
Are you all right?
He asked softly, his voice a contrast to the crushing silence around us. I shook my head, unsure of how to respond. I was as confused as he was. I don't know, I murmured. Everything's so wrong, Daniel. Ahmed, Karim, and Ali are dead. Who else is going to die? He remained silent for a moment, staring out at the horizon where the desert stretched endlessly beneath the starry sky. Then, he placed a gentle hand on mine. His touch was like a small comfort in the chaos we had plunged into, a lifeline in the midst of despair.
I'm scared too, but it's not just fear. There's something inside me. I feel his presence all the time, like Neferkhamon is still here watching us.
His words echoed what I had been feeling as well. We weren't just facing a physical danger. We were trapped in something much bigger, something supernatural and ancient. We sat there in silence for a long time, both aware of the growing tension between us. In the middle of the chaos, finding solace in each other was like clinging to a lifeboat in a storm. Yet I knew it was dangerous. This budding romance could weaken us, distract us from the real threat. But when Daniel leaned in slowly, his eyes locked on mine, I couldn't resist. Our lips met softly, and for a brief moment, the terror that surrounded us seemed to fade. The kiss was an escape, a reprieve amidst the chaos. It was as though, for a few seconds, we could forget what was happening around us and focus only on what we felt for each other. When we pulled apart, he looked at me with an intensity that took my breath away.
Lisa, no matter what happens, I'm with you.
That night, it didn't take long for the horror to return. The scream of one of the local workers broke the night's silence, and everyone rushed out of their tents, unsure of what to expect. One of the men, Youssef, was writhing on the ground, screaming and clutching his arm. When we got closer, we saw the cause of his pain. 2 deep snakebite marks adorned his skin. Blood trickled slowly from the wound, and the venom seemed to be spreading quickly. "Snakes! They just appeared out of nowhere!" one of the workers yelled, trying to help Youssef. But there wasn't much anyone could do. Desert snake venom was lethal, and we didn't have the means to save him. Daniel came up beside me, his expression clouded with grim realization.
This isn't normal. Those snakes, they shouldn't be here. Something drew them.
He was right. It wasn't common to see snakes in the middle of the desert, especially at night. They had come from somewhere, as if called by an invisible force. The curse. The same one that had taken Karim's life was now manifesting in even more sinister ways. We watched helplessly as Youssef succumbed to the venom, his body convulsing until he finally lay still, his eyes staring into nothingness. 4 dead in 2 days. The curse was gaining strength, and we knew this was far from over. The days that followed brought more death. One of the workers woke up screaming, claiming he had been burned alive in a nightmare. His words seemed like madness, but soon we saw the evidence. His skin, especially on his hands and face, was covered in burn marks, as though he had actually been exposed to flames while he slept. There was no rational explanation for it. Others began experiencing disturbing visions. One of the workers woke one night screaming, saying he had seen Neferkhamon standing beside his tent, whispering his name. His fear was palpable, and he refused to continue with the expedition, leaving with several others. The expedition was unraveling quickly. Death and fear surrounded us, and I could feel that we were no longer in control. Every step we took inside or outside the tomb seemed to draw us deeper into Neferkhamon's grasp. As panic mounted and more mysterious deaths occurred, Daniel and I found ourselves growing closer, seeking refuge in each other. Despite the attraction and the growing intimacy between us, we knew it might not last. The curse was entwined with our lives, and there was no way to know who would fall next. One night, as we tried to rest, Daniel turned to me, his eyes searching mine.
We need to find a way to stop this, Lisa. We can't go on like this.
I nodded, feeling the same desperation. The obsidian scarab that had been removed from the sarcophagus seemed to be the key to understanding the curse, but none of our attempts to decipher its symbols had led to a solution. I know, I replied, gripping his hand tightly. But where do we start? Neferkhamon is surrounding us on all sides. He squeezed my hand back, his eyes full of determination and fear.
We'll start tomorrow by studying the hieroglyphs on the sarcophagus again. They must tell us what to do. We can't let anyone else die.
I agreed silently, knowing that despite our efforts, we might have been doomed from the moment we opened that tomb. And as the wind blew through the desert, carrying with it the distant sound of ancient whispers, I knew that the worst was yet to come. The days following Youssef's death were enveloped in a terrifying silence. The atmosphere in the camp was heavy with fear and distrust. The desert, once seen as just a hostile environment, now felt alive. An oppressive force constantly watching us. Every shadow, every whisper of the wind seemed to carry a new warning. I could feel something growing in the air. The curse we had awakened was no longer contained within the tomb. It now spread among us, weaving an invisible web around our lives. Few of us remained in the camp. Those who stayed, like Beaumont, Daniel, and myself, seemed stubbornly bound by a sense of inevitability. Running would not change the fate we had sealed the moment we violated the tomb. Staying, as insane as it seemed, was the only choice that made sense. Beaumont, of course, remained obsessed. He barely slept, spending his nights in his tent surrounded by notes and fragments of inscriptions from the tomb. His hands were stained with ink and dust, but his eyes glowed feverishly, as if he were on the brink of a revelation. He refused to accept that the price of discovery could be so high. For him, the deaths of the workers were unfortunate coincidences. tragic but inevitable in expeditions of this magnitude. I, however, knew better. I knew the deaths were just the first signs of what was to come. Something larger was stirring, something far beyond our comprehension. Pharaoh Neferkhamon was not just a historical figure we had stumbled upon. He was the center of it all, and his presence was no longer confined to the sarcophagus. I spent sleepless nights poring over the hieroglyphs we had copied from the tomb walls. Something about them seemed to pulse with a truth I couldn't yet fully grasp. Some symbols didn't fit the traditional Egyptian iconography. They felt ancient, almost primitive, and they evoked a sense of despair and darkness, as if the very stone cried out for release. One of those nights, with my eyes heavy and my mind swirling with ideas, I finally found what I was looking for. The passage I deciphered spoke of Neferkhamon and his reign. Much of it was familiar. He ruled during a time of instability, and in his final years, his obsession with immortality had intensified. But then, the tone of the text changed. There were mentions of a ritual, a dark pact he had made with an entity I didn't immediately recognize. I continued to decode the text, and my heart raced when I finally understood what it said. Neferkhamon had made a pact with the goddess Ammit, the devourer of souls. She was a dark goddess, feared by the ancient Egyptians, but never openly worshipped. Ammit wasn't part of the main pantheon like Osiris or Isis. She existed in the shadows, in the underworld, waiting to devour those whose souls were unworthy of entering the realm of the dead. She was an entity of destruction and damnation, and Neferkhamon had invoked her, offering a sacrifice in exchange for something far more valuable than earthly power. The pact was clear. Neferkhamon would sacrifice his people, his wealth, and his very soul, all in exchange for eternal life. But there was a condition. He would not live forever in his own body, for the physical body would always decay. Instead, Ammit granted him the ability to be reborn, to take a new body, a new host, centuries or millennia after his death, when the appropriate rituals were performed. And that's when my blood ran cold. The text revealed that Neferkhamon's tomb wasn't just a burial site, but a portal, a threshold between the worlds of the living and the dead. He wasn't confined to the underworld. Neferkhamon awaited the right moment to return to the world of the living. His resurrection required one final sacrifice: the soul of someone alive, someone present when his sarcophagus was opened. I stopped, unable to continue for a moment. Everything made sense all at once. The deaths, the visions, the unexplainable phenomena. Neferkhamon was preparing to return, and to do so, one of us had to die. The next morning, heavy with the weight of my discovery, I went to find Daniel. He sat at the edge of the camp, his gaze lost in the dunes. His expression was dark, as if he already knew what I was about to tell him. In the past few days, he had become more introspective, more distant, but also more determined. "Daniel," I began, my voice hesitant. "I found something about Neferkhamon. He wasn't just a pharaoh. He made a pact with a dark goddess, Ammit." He turned slowly to me, his eyes carrying a weight that made me hesitate.
Ammit, the devourer of souls.
I nodded. Yes. Neferkhamon wanted eternal life, but in exchange, he had to give something. He offered human sacrifices, dozens, maybe hundreds. But the true sacrifice, it required that in the future, when his tomb was opened, someone's soul would be taken so that he could be reborn. Daniel, he needs a living soul to return. One of us. For a moment, Daniel remained silent, absorbing my words. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a frightening understanding.
I know, Lisa.
He looked at me, his eyes locked onto mine.
I've felt it since we opened that tomb. Neferkhamon has already made his choice. He's calling to me.
My heart raced, panic washing over me. "No, Daniel, we can't just accept this. We have to find a way to stop this from happening. It can't be you." He gave a half-smile, devoid of humor.
And how do we stop him? We're dealing with forces we can't control, Lisa. I already feel his presence. He's inside me, waiting for the right moment.
My eyes filled with tears, and I moved closer, gripping his hand tightly. No, I won't let this happen. There's something we can do. I know there is. The obsidian scarab. It has to be the key. We need to understand how to use it. It has a purpose, something that can help us stop Neferkhamon. Daniel stared at the desert for a long time before responding.
Maybe, Lisa, maybe there's a way, but if there isn't, I want you to know that no matter what happens, I'll do everything I can to protect you.
I wanted to scream, to tell him that wasn't enough, that it wasn't fair. But I knew Daniel was being honest. He believed his fate was already sealed, and in some way, I did too. The fear I had felt since entering that tomb seemed to crush me, as if we were all ensnared in a web that tightened with every step we took. We spent the following days trying to find an answer. We studied the remaining hieroglyphs and the obsidian scarab. I believed the artifact wasn't just a funerary piece. It seemed to emit an energy, something I couldn't explain rationally, but I knew it was real. It was as if the scarab was the last barrier between us and Neferkhamon's rebirth. Meanwhile, Daniel continued to distance himself, as if something inside him was taking over. He seemed to hear voices I couldn't hear, and in moments of distraction, I'd see him staring into nothingness, as if engaged in a silent conversation with the Pharaoh himself. His skin grew paler, and his hands trembled often. I feared he was losing the battle against Neferkhamon's presence within him. Beaumont, on the other hand, remained blind to the reality unfolding around us. He still believed we were on the verge of the archaeological discovery of the century. I saw him eyeing the scarab with bright, greedy eyes, as if it were the key to endless glory, unaware of how close we were to total destruction. And then, on the final night, everything changed. I was alone in my tent, reviewing my notes on the scarab for what felt like the 100th time. Something was on the verge of being revealed. I knew it. It was as if the answer was right in front of me, but my eyes couldn't see it. Then, from outside, I heard a scream. I rushed outside, my heart pounding, and saw Daniel standing near the entrance to the tomb. His face was pale, his gaze fixed on the emptiness before him. "Daniel!" I screamed, running toward him. But as I got closer, he turned slowly, and what I saw froze me to the core. His eyes, once full of life and emotion, were now empty, lifeless. His expression was distant, as if he was no longer there. And when he finally spoke, the voice that emerged was not Daniel's. It was an ancient voice, deep and filled with power.
The time has come. The sacrifice will be made.
I knew then that Neferkhamon was closer than ever. The atmosphere in the camp was thick, almost suffocating. The desert, once vast and unforgiving, now felt claustrophobic, as if the very dunes were closing in on us, compressing the space more and more. The previous night had been the worst yet. Daniel, possessed by a dark presence, had become a puppet in Neferkhamon's hands. The words that left his mouth were not his own, and his eyes, once full of life, now seemed like portals to something far darker. I knew time was running out. If we didn't find a way to stop Neferkhamon, his resurrection would be complete, and he would take over Daniel's body forever. Desperation coursed through my veins like poison, and with every second I felt the fear growing. Yet, there was a flicker of hope. We didn't just have the obsidian scarab as a clue. There was something else buried deep within that tomb, something that could give us a fighting chance. Then, I remembered a reference we had found days ago, but dismissed at the time. Beaumont had briefly mentioned discovering fragments of a deteriorated scroll near the sarcophagus. In the rush to open the tomb, we had all ignored that small find. But now, with Neferkhamon so close to completing his ritual, I knew that scroll could be our salvation. The first thing I did the next morning was to search through the old expedition notes. I found the reports and, finally, the details about the scroll that had been cast aside. It was in tatters, difficult to read, but it contained something extremely important. Fragments of the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead was a collection of spells and rituals used by the ancient Egyptians to guide souls through the afterlife. It also held secrets about controlling souls and, most importantly, how to prevent the resurrection of dark beings. I knew that if Neferkhamon had used dark spells to cheat death, the key to breaking his curse would be in that book. "Daniel, we need to find that scroll," I said quickly as I approached him. His state was unstable, as if he was floating between who he really was and Neferkhamon's influence. I knew time was working against us. He looked at me, his expression grave. Even under the shadow of the possession that threatened to consume him completely, Daniel seemed to understand the gravity of the situation.
The Book of the Dead, do you think it holds the key?
His voice was weaker, as if he was struggling to maintain control of himself. "Yes, I know it does. We need to decipher what's in that scroll before it's too late." We rushed to where Beaumont had stored the scroll fragments. He was in the small tent we used to keep the artifacts found in the tomb. When we saw him, his eyes gleamed with a disturbing intensity. It was as if the proximity to Neferkhamon's power was affecting all of us. Beaumont, so obsessed with the glory this discovery would bring, was blind to the imminent danger.
You're still chasing after a magical solution to a superstition?
He said mockingly.
This is pure gold, Lisa. This scroll contains ancient secrets and Neferkhamon's sarcophagus. We don't have time for distractions.
Ignoring his words, I found the box where the fragments were stored. As I opened it, the smell of old papyrus filled the air, mixed with the desert dust. The fragments were fragile but legible. I knew this held the key to ending the curse, or at least to trying to reverse what we had unleashed. With Daniel watching, I began deciphering the text, my hands trembling slightly as I touched the papyrus. Ancient words emerged from the faded lines. Purification rituals, spells to banish evil spirits, and finally, a section on what to do when a king of darkness attempted to return to the world of the living. "Here it is," I murmured, barely believing what I was reading. The scroll describes a banishment ritual, a way to imprison a soul trying to escape death. But to do it, we need something specific, the heart of the soul we want to banish. I looked at Daniel, and the weight of my words fell upon us. Neferkhamon's heart. Could it be that this artifact was hidden somewhere in the tomb? Or could we neutralize his soul without the physical heart? Daniel, struggling to maintain control, shook his head.
His heart is buried somewhere in this tomb. But the heart isn't just physical, Lisa. There's a spiritual connection. And that's what we need to break.
I knew he was right. Neferkhamon wasn't an ordinary pharaoh. His soul was tied to something far deeper, and breaking that connection was the only way to stop him from returning. In the hours that followed, Daniel and I prepared to enter the tomb again. The shadows around us seemed longer, more threatening, as if the desert itself were conspiring against us. The wind carried whispers I couldn't fully understand, but the fear was clear. Before we descended, Daniel paused for a moment and took my hand.
If something goes wrong down there, you need to leave. I can feel Neferkhamon calling me, and I don't know how much longer I can resist.
I wanted to protest, to tell him I wouldn't leave him alone. But the truth was, we both knew how serious the situation had become. Neferkhamon's presence within Daniel was growing stronger, and time was running out. With one last look, we headed toward the entrance of the tomb where it had all begun. The tomb felt different now. Every step we took into its depths felt heavier, as if the very earth wanted to trap us there. The walls, once covered with inert inscriptions, now seemed to faintly glow with a malevolent energy, as if pulsing to the rhythm of an invisible heart. As we descended, Daniel began to sweat. His steps were hesitant, and his breathing grew more irregular.
He's here. I can feel him.
The temperature around us plummeted. The air flowing from the tomb was dense, almost impossible to breathe. I knew Neferkhamon's presence was growing stronger. We finally reached the sarcophagus, where everything had started. The obsidian scarab that had been removed from the top of the sarcophagus was in my hand, but now it felt heavier, almost pulsating, as if it had absorbed part of the energy Neferkhamon had left behind. I knew this artifact was the key, but how? As I stared at the scarab, Daniel staggered, clutching his head in his hands.
He's trying to take control.
He gasped. His internal struggle was evident. Neferkhamon was close, too close to completely overtaking him. Then I remembered the passage in the scroll. To seal the soul of a king, one must purify the heart with the fire of truth. But how could we do that? Suddenly, an idea struck me. The sarcophagus of Neferkhamon still had the ancient inscriptions engraved on its surface. They contained the original ritual that had kept him sealed. If I could read those inscriptions, maybe I could complete the purification ritual and seal his soul forever. I quickly knelt beside the sarcophagus, trying to decipher the inscriptions as Daniel struggled to maintain control over his body. The words were faded, but I managed to read the crucial phrase: "He who wields the heart of the Pharaoh and speaks the fire of truth shall stop the return of the dead." That was it. The obsidian scarab represented Neferkhamon's heart, and the words of purification, which needed to be spoken, were part of the ritual contained in the Book of the Dead. With a trembling voice, I began reciting the words inscribed on the sarcophagus, using the scarab as a conduit. The air around us started to vibrate, and a faint but growing light emanated from the scarab. Neferkhamon was resisting. Daniel screamed, the pain clear in his eyes as he fought against the Pharaoh's presence in his mind. But I kept going, forcing every word, every syllable out of my mouth, even as despair tried to silence me. Then, an explosion of energy shook the tomb. Daniel collapsed to his knees, and for a moment, silence reigned. The scarab glowed brightly and then disintegrated into dust before my eyes. Neferkhamon's presence vanished. Kneeling on the ground, I was exhausted but alive. Daniel, still shaken, looked at me with eyes full of relief and exhaustion.
You did it?
He murmured, before collapsing. I held his hand, feeling the weight of what we had just accomplished. We had broken the curse. We had defeated Neferkhamon. But at what cost? The silence after the explosion of energy was as terrifying as the battle we had just faced. Daniel was still unconscious beside me, but his breathing was steady, and his body finally seemed at peace. For the first time in days, the invisible weight of Neferkhamon's presence seemed to have lifted. Yet deep inside, I knew the fight wasn't over. As I held Daniel's hand, exhausted and breathless, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly the end. The scarab had dissolved, the ritual had been completed, but the curse felt larger than all of us. Something still troubled me, a persistent sense that Neferkhamon wasn't truly defeated. A few hours later, as the sun began to set, Daniel finally opened his eyes. He blinked slowly, still disoriented, and then his eyes found mine. There was something different about him now. His presence seemed darker, not in a terrifying way like before, but with a deep sadness, a weight that seemed to have settled on his shoulders.
Lisa, we need to talk.
I knew those words carried a secret he had kept for a long time, a secret that now seemed impossible to ignore. A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't that Daniel was hesitating or afraid to speak. He seemed to finally accept what he had been hiding. "What's going on, Daniel?" I asked, my voice trembling. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the truth. He slowly sat up, his face still showing signs of exhaustion, and ran a hand through his sweaty hair. His dark eyes met mine again, and for a moment, he seemed lost in thought. When he started to speak, his voice was deep, filled with an intensity that made me feel he was revealing something he had never told anyone.
There's something I've never told you, something that might make you hate me.
I stayed silent, my heart racing. Daniel looked at me, trying to gauge my reaction before continuing.
My family, my past. I come from an ancient lineage, something that has haunted me my entire life, but I never fully understood until now. Lisa, I am a direct descendant of the priests who served Neferkhamon.
His words fell on me like a crushing weight, shattering any hope that we had escaped the fate that had been following us. Daniel, the person I trusted most, was intrinsically linked to the Pharaoh we had been trying to stop. My mind spun, trying to process what he had just revealed. "What do you mean?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "What does that mean?" Daniel took a deep breath, as if preparing his heart for the dark truth he was about to share.
My family, for generations, was entrusted with a task to preserve Neferkhamon's secret and ensure that one day he could return to the world of the living. My ancestors served him, believing they were helping a pharaoh who would bring a new kind of order to the world. But there was something more.
He looked at me with pain in his eyes.
They also knew that when the time came, the last descendant, me, would be the link, the final sacrifice to bring Neferkhamon back.
I couldn't breathe. The shock of his words hit me like a tidal wave. Daniel was saying that he was the connection to Neferkhamon's resurrection. The curse that haunted all of us was directly tied to him. "This can't be true," I stammered, struggling to believe what I was hearing.
I wish it weren't. I spent my life running from it, trying to deny what my family always told me. But when we got here, when we opened that tomb, everything started to make sense. The visions, the calls. Neferkhamon always knew I would be here. He's been waiting for me.
I pulled away slightly, trying to process what he had said. Everything was falling into place. The reason Daniel had always been so sensitive to Neferkhamon's presence, why he seemed to be the primary target of the curse. But this meant he was doomed. He was the key to bringing Neferkhamon back. "So, all of this," I began, my voice trembling. "All these deaths, this curse, it's happening because you're here?"
Not by choice, Lisa. I would never have come if I knew how much was at stake. But now I realize I always knew. This was my destiny.
I didn't know what to feel. Anger and fear clashed with the love and compassion I felt for him. Daniel had always been honest with me, and I knew he would never have chosen to be the cause of such tragedy. But the reality was cruel. He was the link. He was the final piece in Neferkhamon's plan.
Lisa, now that you know the truth, you have to understand that I may not be able to resist for much longer. Neferkhamon is already inside me. He's already taking over.
I watched him, tears welling up in my eyes, the pain in my chest growing unbearable. How could I choose between the man I loved and the world? Daniel knew his fate was sealed, but I wasn't ready to lose him. Not now, not like this. "I won't let that happen," I declared, my voice filled with determination. "We'll find another way. The scarab, the ritual from the Book of the Dead. We have to try again." Daniel shook his head, his dark eyes full of sadness.
I'm already marked, Lisa. The scarab and the ritual were just a pause, a delay. The truth is, Neferkhamon is still lurking, waiting, and he's getting stronger.
He gripped my hand tightly, his eyes burning with emotion.
You can't let him return. You can't let him use my body to come back.
I felt the ground crumble beneath me, the despair consuming every fiber of my being. The weight of what Daniel was asking was unbearable. He knew that in the end I might have to make a terrible decision. "No, Daniel," I murmured, squeezing his hand tightly. "We won't give up. I love you. I'm not going to lose you to this curse." He smiled sadly, his eyes full of a mixture of love and resignation.
I love you too, Lisa, but sometimes love means making sacrifices.
In the days that followed, the curse seemed to intensify around us. The remaining team members were on the verge of madness, plagued by terrifying visions and increasingly real nightmares. The desert seemed ready to swallow us whole, and Neferkhamon's tomb continued to pulse with dark energy. Beaumont, blinded by his ambition, kept insisting we explore further. He didn't understand that we were on the brink of unleashing an ancient evil. Daniel and I, however, kept fighting against the inevitable. We studied every fragment of inscription, every piece of the Book of the Dead, desperately trying to find a solution. But the more we tried, the clearer it became that Neferkhamon was always one step ahead. He had prepared for this moment. He knew Daniel was destined to be the final sacrifice. Deep down, I knew my only chance to save the world from Neferkhamon was to break the link, to break Daniel. But how could I do that? How could I destroy the person I loved to save the rest of the world? On the final night, as despair reached its peak, Daniel approached me while I was studying the scrolls one last time. He pulled me close and, with a voice full of emotion, whispered in my ear.
When the time comes, Lisa, you know what you have to do.
Tears were streaming freely down my face now, and I wanted to scream, to tell him I wouldn't do it, that I couldn't. But deep down, I knew he was right. He was the link that would allow Neferkhamon to return. And I was the only one who could stop him. The desert heat was more oppressive than ever. The weight hanging over the camp was almost suffocating, as if the very air was charged with an unseen force. Ever since Daniel had revealed the secret of his lineage, everything between us had changed. I could feel the tension thickening in the air, like a supernatural force pressing down on us, waiting for the right moment to strike. Neferkhamon was watching, waiting, and we were running out of time. That morning, everything felt darker. The sun burned with a relentless intensity, and the wind, usually a constant presence, had stilled, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. We knew something was about to happen. The tomb of Neferkhamon wasn't just a burial site anymore. It had become a portal. And that portal was opening. Beaumont, still consumed by his stubborn quest for glory, pushed us to keep going. He refused to see the danger, or maybe he just wouldn't admit it. To him, the mystery of Neferkhamon was the key to his academic immortality. But for us, it was a death sentence. Daniel had grown quieter than usual, and I could see the internal conflict eating away at him. Neferkhamon's presence inside him was growing, and the struggle to maintain his own identity was becoming harder each day. I wanted to believe there was still time to save him, but the truth was, he was slipping further away from me, more and more under the control of the ancient Pharaoh's dark spirit.
Lisa, we have to go back to the tomb.
Daniel, no! I protested. Every time you go down there, Neferkhamon pulls you in deeper. We can't keep doing this. Daniel looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw something that chilled me to the core. It wasn't just desperation, it was acceptance. He knew the end was near.
There's no other choice. If we don't go back, he's going to take me anyway. If I can slow him down, if we can find a way to close the portal, maybe there's still a chance.
The pain in his voice hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew Daniel was speaking the truth. He was fighting an enemy we couldn't see, but that had already marked him as its next victim. With a final, resigned breath, I agreed. We had to go back to the tomb. We descended through the narrow, suffocating passageways of the tomb one last time. The absolute silence around us was unnerving. The walls, once faded with time, now seemed to faintly glow with an eerie light, as if the tomb itself was alive, pulsing with Neferkhamon's energy. Every step we took echoed with a distant sound, as though it came from somewhere deep, far beyond the stone walls. The air was thick, and the darkness around us seemed to shift, alive with something I couldn't fully comprehend.
He's here. He's closer than ever.
The change in Daniel was terrifying. He grew weaker with every passing minute, his breath shallow, his steps unsteady. Neferkhamon was taking over, slowly but surely. We need to find the sarcophagus, the purification ritual. There might still be a chance to stop this. We knew the sarcophagus of Neferkhamon was the key. If we could trap his spirit, if we could complete the ritual from the Book of the Dead, maybe, just maybe, we could save Daniel and stop Neferkhamon from fully resurrecting. When we reached the main chamber, the sight that greeted us was pure horror. Neferkhamon's sarcophagus was completely open now, and a dark, almost tangible energy filled the air. The stone lid that had once sealed his body was shattered. His essence was free, and it felt as though he was moments away from returning to life. A chill ran down my spine as we moved closer. Daniel was trembling, his eyes wide with fear and his skin pale, as if all the blood had drained from his body.
He's bare.
Daniel whispered, his voice strained with pain. It was as if Neferkhamon was speaking through him. Suddenly, the walls of the chamber began to shake. A deafening rumble echoed around us, like the tomb itself was collapsing. The structure was falling apart. "We have to get out of here," I screamed, pulling at Daniel, but he was frozen, paralyzed in place. Stones began to fall from the walls, and the floor trembled violently beneath our feet. The chamber was about to cave in, and I knew if we didn't escape, we'd be buried alive along with Neferkhamon's spirit. I tugged on Daniel with all my strength, trying to drag him toward the exit, but he resisted, his eyes glazed over, as if he were in a trance. "Daniel, please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "Don't let him take you." For a moment, I thought I had lost him. His body was stiff, his breathing shallow. But then, in one final effort, Daniel seemed to regain a sliver of control. He looked at me, his eyes filled with pain and despair.
Go. I can't leave you here. Go.
"I'm not leaving you," I shouted back, my voice shaking with emotion. But before I could react, part of the ceiling came crashing down, blocking the path back to the sarcophagus. Neferkhamon was closing in on us, trapping us. The supernatural forces protecting the tomb were intensifying. The air around us was suffocating, and the darkness seemed to be swallowing us whole. I knew we didn't have much time left. With one last desperate gasp, Daniel grabbed my hand, and with tremendous effort, he began running with me toward the tomb's exit. The walls shook violently, and stones rained down around us with every step. The sound of rocks crashing to the ground behind us echoed like thunder, and the panic in me grew with every second. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached the tomb's entrance. The collapse was right on our heels, and with a final desperate leap, we tumbled out of the darkness and rolled onto the hot desert sand, just as the entrance sealed shut with a deafening crash. We lay there, gasping for breath, covered in dust, as the desert around us seemed to absorb all sound, as if nature itself had paused to witness the aftermath. For a brief moment, I thought we'd done it. The tomb was closed, and the collapse seemed to have ended Neferkhamon's dark chapter. But then I looked at Daniel, and my heart sank. He was trembling, his eyes tightly shut, and his breathing was irregular. His skin was even paler than before, almost translucent, and tiny beads of sweat trickled down his forehead. "Daniel," I whispered, kneeling beside him. His eyes fluttered open slowly, but what I saw made me recoil in horror. Daniel's eyes were dark, almost black. They weren't his eyes anymore. Something else was looking through them, something evil. He convulsed, as if he were fighting against something inside himself, and then, with a voice that wasn't his, but was filled with the same dark energy we'd felt in the tomb, he spoke.
Neferkhamon cannot be stopped. I am the portal. He will return.
I stumbled back, horrified. The collapse of the tomb hadn't been the end. Neferkhamon was taking over Daniel's body, slowly but surely. The Pharaoh's spirit was manifesting more and more, and the man I loved was vanishing before my eyes. Neferkhamon didn't need a ritual anymore. He had already found his new host. As I stared at Daniel, terror clawing at my insides, I realized the real battle had just begun. The tomb of Neferkhamon had closed, but his spirit was more alive than ever, inside Daniel. The sun was beginning to set over the Egyptian desert, casting the horizon in hues of orange and red. The relentless heat that had followed us all day was finally fading. But the usual relief that came with the arrival of night was replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. The tomb of Neferkhamon was sealed, but the true threat was now with us, inside Daniel. Sitting beside him as we tried to recover from the collapse of the tomb, I felt that something had shifted irreversibly. Daniel, a shadow of the man I once knew, was struggling. His hands shook, and his eyes flickered between moments of lucidity and that haunting blackness, as though Neferkhamon was slowly taking over. I could sense that time was running out. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, barely hiding my panic. I knew that if we stayed, we were all doomed. The desert stretched out endlessly before us, an immense, empty expanse offering no refuge. We couldn't stay near the tomb any longer, but the journey to Cairo seemed impossible. We had no idea what awaited us on the way, or if we'd even make it there alive. Beaumont, stubborn as always, was unwilling to abandon the camp.
We can't leave now. We're on the verge of a monumental discovery. The tomb, it's everything. I need...
"No, Richard!" I shouted, my patience wearing thin. "It's over. Neferkhamon won't leave us alone. We need to get out while we still can." He stared at me with a mix of contempt and disbelief. Beaumont, with all his academic knowledge and unbridled ambition, was blind to the real danger we were facing. To him, science and history were sacred, and he couldn't grasp the gravity of the supernatural threat looming over us. Daniel, on the other hand, was silent. He could barely stand, and I knew that Neferkhamon was consuming him from the inside. His time was running out.
We have to leave. You need to go, Lisa, now.
I looked at him, my eyes welling up with tears. I couldn't leave him behind, but I didn't know how to save him either. "I'm not leaving you, Daniel. We'll find a way to end this together." He closed his eyes, as if fighting to hold on to what little control he had left.
There's no time. He's taking me, every second. I feel Neferkhamon getting closer.
We made the decision to leave. The few remaining members of the team, terrified and scarred by the events of the past days, prepared for the journey back to Cairo. The trip would be long, but staying was no longer an option. I felt the weight of the curse bearing down on me as we packed up the few supplies and equipment we still had. There was something following us, something unseen but ever present. A constant, suffocating force that left me on edge. It was as if Neferkhamon's spirit had somehow latched onto me. As we moved away from the camp, the desert wind picked up, carrying with it an unsettling feeling. The silence was broken only by the sound of our footsteps in the sand, but every now and then I heard whispers that seemed to come from all directions, calling my name. I glanced back several times, half expecting to see someone or something following us, but the desert was empty. Yet I knew we weren't alone. The curse had been unleashed, and now it was hunting us. As we trekked further into the desert, heading toward Cairo, the first attack happened. Dusk was giving way to night, and the desert seemed even more vast and desolate under the pale glow of the moon. Suddenly, one of the lanterns we carried flickered and went out, and a sharp scream pierced the silence. One of the local workers who had decided to join us lay in the sand, his eyes wide in terror. We rushed to him, but it was too late. His body was twisted in an unnatural position, as if something invisible had contorted him to death. His face was frozen in agony. There was nothing we could do. Daniel, barely able to stay on his feet, looked at me with panic in his eyes. The curse was following us, and there was no way to escape.
He's coming for us.
I knew he was right. Neferkhamon was pursuing us, using the desert as his weapon, and those who fell along the way were only the first victims. "We have to keep moving," I said, my voice shaking. "We can't stop." The others were clearly shaken, but we had no choice. If we stopped, we would die. So we kept moving through the darkness, the desert wind growing stronger, carrying with it the whispers of an ancient pharaoh who knew no peace. Over the next few hours, more members of the team began to fall. Some collapsed from exhaustion, but the most terrifying deaths were the inexplicable ones. Dark shapes flickered in the corners of our vision, and within seconds, someone would drop, as if pulled by an invisible force. I knew we were being hunted by something far older and more powerful than we could comprehend. With every death, I felt the curse tightening its grip around us, making it impossible to ignore the truth. Neferkhamon was hunting us, and he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. At one of our stops, Beaumont finally broke down. He, who had been so stubborn and skeptical throughout the journey, was now consumed by fear.
This is my fault. We went too far. I shouldn't have...
But his words were cut off by a blood-curdling scream. A dark figure appeared out of nowhere, and another one of the workers was dragged into the desert's shadows, disappearing without a trace. I stood frozen, unable to move. The curse was manifesting with full force, hunting us down one by one. The worst moment, however, came just before dawn, when the darkness was about to give way to the first rays of sunlight. We were exhausted, barely able to keep going, and I could feel Neferkhamon's presence growing closer. It was as if the very air around us was filled with his essence. Then, without warning, Daniel collapsed to his knees in the sand, clutching his head in his hands.
He's inside me.
He gasped, his voice faltering with every word. His eyes were wide with terror, and I saw the absolute fear in them. "No!" I screamed, running to him. But it was too late. Daniel writhed on the ground, screaming as he fought against the presence of Neferkhamon, who was finally taking full control. His eyes, which for a brief moment still held a trace of his humanity, were now dark, completely consumed by shadow.
Lisa,
He murmured, Neferkhamon's voice echoing through his words.
you cannot fight the inevitable. I will return, and nothing can stop me.
I stumbled back in horror. Daniel was gone. His body now belonged to Neferkhamon. And with that, I knew the real battle had only just begun. I was alone against the immortal Pharaoh. The desert was steeped in deadly silence, broken only by the occasional gust of wind that sent grains of sand swirling around us. Daniel, or what was left of him, stood before me, his eyes as dark as the night, and the presence of Neferkhamon loomed within him, like an oppressive shadow that dominated the air. I wanted to believe that Daniel was still in there, fighting against the Pharaoh taking over his body. But every passing second, I saw the man I loved being consumed by an ancient, relentless force, transforming him into something he was never meant to be. Neferkhamon had returned, and his power was manifesting through Daniel's body, a terrifying and unnatural fusion of two souls that should never have met. "Daniel," my voice trembled, barely audible. "Please, fight this." His eyes, no longer his, fixed on me, and I felt the crushing weight of the dark power residing within.
Daniel is lost, Lisa.
He said, but it wasn't Daniel's voice. It was deep, ancient, laced with disdain. Neferkhamon was in full control.
He is merely a vessel for my return. Now that I'm free, neither you nor anyone else can stop me.
My hands trembled, fear wrapping around me like a cold chain. The love I felt for Daniel clashed violently with the horror of what he had become. Neferkhamon had taken his body, but part of Daniel was still there. I refused to believe he was completely gone. "I won't give up on you," I shouted, desperation clawing at me. Neferkhamon smiled coldly, emotionless, as he slowly advanced, his footsteps steady and silent in the sand. His very presence seemed to devour the light around us.
You are weak, like all mortals.
He said, his eyes burning with hatred.
For millennia I have waited for this moment, and now you stand in my way.
Before I could react, an invisible force slammed into me. I was thrown to the ground, the hot sand burning my skin as I struggled to get up. My body was weak, pain radiating through every muscle. But the terror I felt for Daniel, or what he had become, was what kept me moving. "Daniel," I whispered, trying to gather my strength. "You're still in there. I know you are." Neferkhamon paused, his eyes darkening further as he regarded me with disdain.
He can no longer hear you,
he said. But there was a slight hesitation in his voice, a faint tremor. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker in Daniel's eyes, a glimpse of who he truly was. It gave me strength. I knew Daniel was still there, buried somewhere deep within that darkness, fighting against the evil spirit that had overtaken him, and I had to do whatever it took to bring him back, even if it meant standing in Neferkhamon's path. "Daniel!" I shouted louder now, rising to my feet, my determination swelling. "I know you're in there. Fight! Don't let him take you!" Neferkhamon stopped again, and this time, I saw the expression on his face falter, just for a moment. Daniel was fighting.
Lisa.
His voice was hoarse, almost a whisper, but it was Daniel. For a second, I recognized him. He was still there, battling the Pharaoh's control. Tears filled my eyes as I stepped closer. "Yes! Daniel! It's you! I'm here!" But my joy was short-lived. The internal struggle inside Daniel was far from over. Neferkhamon roared with fury, and Daniel's body contorted violently, as if he were being torn apart from within. The battle between the two souls was intensifying.
He is mine.
Neferkhamon bellowed, his voice mingling with Daniel's in a hellish cacophony.
This body belongs to me.
The power of the Pharaoh was overwhelming. A wave of dark energy erupted around us, kicking up a storm of sand. The force of it struck me like an invisible wall, knocking me to the ground once more. It was as if the desert itself was being summoned by Neferkhamon, answering his call for destruction. The ground began to tremble, and I could feel his power growing, radiating through every grain of sand around us. Neferkhamon was stronger than ever, and Daniel was being pulled deeper into his darkness.
You will lose.
Daniel screamed, his voice finally breaking through the chaos, fighting with every ounce of strength he had left. He was resisting, but I knew he couldn't do it alone. I rose to my feet with difficulty, every movement a protest from my aching body. The wind and sand blinded me, but I knew what I had to do. I had to help him fight. With my eyes narrowed against the storm, I ran toward Daniel, knowing this might be my last chance. I needed to touch him, to pull him back. When I reached Daniel, I grabbed his face in my hands, forcing him to look at me. His eyes, still dark, were filled with pain and conflict. "Fight, Daniel!" I begged, tears streaming down my face. "Don't give up! I'm here! Come back to me!" For a moment, his eyes seemed to clear, and I saw the Daniel I loved, the man who was fighting against the cruel fate that had been thrust upon him. Neferkhamon was still there, but Daniel's will was holding on.
Lisa,
Daniel's voice came through again, and this time it was stronger. He was gaining ground in the internal battle, and I clung to that hope. But before I could respond, Neferkhamon, enraged by Daniel's resistance, unleashed another wave of power, throwing me back, crashing into the sand.
You are weak, Daniel.
Neferkhamon roared, his voice dripping with fury.
Accept your destiny.
Fighting through the pain, I stood again, refusing to give up. I knew Daniel was close to breaking the Pharaoh's control, but he needed help. I needed to find a way to seal Neferkhamon for good, and fast. Desperation surged through me, and then something clicked. The power of connection, of love. Whatever Neferkhamon had brought with him, he underestimated the strength of our bond. I could feel it. Daniel wasn't alone in this fight, and I knew that together, we could expel the Pharaoh from his mind and body. Closing my eyes, I placed my hands on Daniel's chest, ignoring the darkness that surrounded him, and began to recite the words of the purification spell, the only one I knew well enough to try. "I release you, Daniel." I whispered the words like a vow, my voice trembling. "I call you back. Fight." I felt immediate resistance, like Neferkhamon was clinging to Daniel's soul with everything he had. The battle had reached its peak, and Daniel's fate was being decided in that very moment. Daniel screamed, his body shaking violently, and for a moment I thought he would collapse. But something shifted. His eyes, once consumed by darkness, began to clear, the light returning little by little.
Neferkhamon will not win.
Daniel shouted with every last ounce of strength he had, his voice echoing across the desert. And then, with a final roar of fury, Neferkhamon was expelled. Daniel collapsed into my arms, exhausted, as the Pharaoh's dark presence dissipated into the desert wind. I sobbed, holding Daniel close, feeling the weight of the battle lift at last. Daniel had won. He was with me again. But in the distance, I sensed a faint presence, an echo of Neferkhamon, like a shadow that would never fully disappear. The battle had been won, but the ancient pharaoh still lingered, waiting for the right moment to try again. For now, though, Daniel was safe. And I, exhausted and in tears, knew that love had given us the strength to resist the evil that had tried to destroy us. The desert seemed more vast and threatening as night fell around us. Stars appeared in the sky, but their glow brought no relief. Neferkhamon was still present. Even after the battle Daniel had fought within himself, something dark and ancient still lingered over us, like a shadow refusing to fade. Daniel's body, exhausted and shaken, was resting, but I knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The Pharaoh's spirit hadn't been defeated, and his influence over Daniel was far from over. There were few of us left. Our team had been reduced to just a handful of survivors, each marked by the terror we had faced. But what kept us moving was a faint spark of hope, the possibility that there was still a way to stop Neferkhamon for good. An ancient ritual. As we gathered around a small campfire, temporarily shielded by the desert's darkness, Professor Beaumont, his body weakened and his mind weighed down by guilt and frustrated ambition, finally revealed something that could change everything.
There's one last chance,
He said, his voice weak but filled with urgency. His eyes were red, the signs of sleepless nights etched into his weary face.
I remembered a manuscript I read years ago about a ritual meant to seal the soul of ancient kings who refused to rest. A sacrifice ritual.
Beaumont's words were met with a heavy silence. Sacrifice. I knew the moment he spoke that the cost to stop Neferkhamon would be devastating. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice harder than I intended. I was exhausted, desperate, but I couldn't afford to let fear overtake me. Daniel was in danger, and Neferkhamon was closer than ever to fully taking control of his body. Beaumont looked at me, his eyes filled with sorrow.
This ritual, it requires a human sacrifice.
He began, hesitating before continuing.
The soul of someone who has been directly marked by Neferkhamon must be offered to seal his spirit back into the underworld. It's the only way to prevent him from returning to the land of the living. Neferkhamon is already inside Daniel, and the sacrifice would be him.
The gravity of his words hung in the air, and everything inside me froze. Daniel. I knew deep down that Neferkhamon wouldn't let Daniel go. He wanted Daniel as his vessel, his return. But to sacrifice him? It was too much. I couldn't do it. No! My voice cut through the silence, firm and filled with conviction. We're not sacrificing Daniel. There has to be another way. Beaumont shook his head, his eyes heavy with sadness.
If we don't, Neferkhamon will fully take over his body. And when that happens, the world will pay the price.
I looked over at Daniel, who lay a few feet away, still unconscious, his breathing heavy and uneven. The weight of the decision crushed my chest. I loved him, and now I was facing an impossible choice. If we sacrificed him, we could stop Neferkhamon, but that meant losing Daniel forever. And if we did nothing, the Pharaoh would take full control of his body, bringing destruction to all of us. Lisa, Mohammed, one of the Egyptian workers who had survived, spoke, pulling me from my dark thoughts. There's a way to delay the ritual, to stop the Pharaoh from fully taking over Daniel, at least for a short time. I know of old stories about this. I looked at Mohammed, hoping for some kind of solution. He was the calmest among us, the only one who hadn't completely succumbed to despair. He moved closer to the fire, his eyes fixed on the flames, as if the answers were dancing there in the quiet heat. In ancient Egypt, priests used an artifact, something that could contain the soul of a king until the final ritual could be performed. The obsidian scarab we found can be used as a spiritual vessel. It still holds power over Neferkhamon. We can use it to trap his spirit for a time, but not forever. My heart raced. There was hope, even if it was a fragile one. We didn't have to sacrifice Daniel yet. If we could use the scarab to contain Neferkhamon, it would buy us time. Time to find another way. a solution that didn't involve Daniel's death. "How much time does that give us?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Mohammed shook his head slowly.
"Not much. Maybe a few hours, maybe a day if we're lucky. The scarab is powerful, but it wasn't made to hold a soul like Neferkhamon's for long. He will escape, sooner or later." My stomach turned. We had one last chance, one final battle to face. "Let's do it," I murmured, determined. "I'm not losing Daniel to that monster."
With Mohammed and Beaumont preparing the scarab for the ritual, we approached Daniel. He was still unconscious, but I knew Neferkhamon was lurking, waiting for the right moment to seize full control. The air around us felt thick with a malignant energy, as if the desert itself was waiting for the conclusion of this final confrontation. "Daniel," I whispered, kneeling beside him. I took his hand, feeling the faint warmth that still remained in his body. "I'm here. I won't let you go." For a moment his eyes opened and I saw Daniel, not Neferkhamon, but the man I loved. His gaze was tired, but there was a flicker of recognition.
"Lisa,"
he murmured, his voice weak.
"I'm fighting, but he's here, he's taking me."
Tears threatened to fall, but I held them back. I needed to be strong for him. "I know, Daniel, but we have a plan. We're going to delay him. We're not letting him take you completely." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, as if trying to gather strength.
"You have to stop this.
He said with difficulty.
If Neferkhamon takes control, you know what you have to do."
"No, Daniel!" My voice broke as I fought against the tears. "I'm not letting that happen." But he opened his eyes again, and this time there was a sad acceptance in them.
"Lisa, if he wins, if he takes me, you have to do what's necessary."
I shook my head, refusing to accept this reality. But deep down, I knew he was right. If the Pharaoh fully took over, there would be no coming back. Beaumont called my name. He and Mohammed had finished preparing the scarab for the ritual. It was time to try and contain Neferkhamon one last time, to delay the inevitable. Mohammed began chanting in an ancient language, and the air around us grew heavier, as if the desert was responding to the ritual. The scarab began to glow, emitting a faint but steady light as Mohammed held it over Daniel's chest. "By the soul marked by darkness, we call upon you." Mohammed's voice was deep and filled with authority. "Neferkhamon, Lord of Shadows, you shall be contained." Daniel's body began to tremble, and for a moment I feared Neferkhamon was resisting the ritual. But then the scarab glowed brighter, and Daniel let out a deep breath, his muscles relaxing under the spell's effect.
"We did it,"
Beaumont murmured, but his voice was laced with caution. I looked at Daniel. He was at peace, for now. Neferkhamon had been contained. But for how long?
"This will hold him,"
Mohammed said, his voice heavy with exhaustion.
"But only for a few hours. We need to be ready for the worst when the effect wears off."
I knew he was right. This was only a temporary reprieve. Time was against us, and Neferkhamon's shadow still loomed over Daniel, threatening to destroy everything. The sacrifice had been delayed, but not avoided. We knew that soon we would have to make the final decision, and I wasn't sure if I had the strength to do what was necessary. The desert wind howled around us, whipping up clouds of sand that blinded us, making it impossible to see beyond the small fire we had lit. We were alone, isolated in the vast emptiness, waiting for the inevitable. Time was running out, and we all knew it. Neferkhamon was still contained within Daniel's body, but the scarab could only hold him for a few more hours. I sat beside Daniel, watching his fragile body, his pale face marked by the strain of fighting against the spirit consuming him. Inside I was torn. I loved him more than anything, but I knew Neferkhamon was trapped inside him, waiting for the right moment to break free and take full control of his mind and body. Mohammed, calm and steady as always, approached me and gently placed a hand on my shoulder. "Time is running out, Lisa," he said, his voice low and grave. "The scarab won't hold him much longer." I knew he was right. Daniel was unconscious, and Neferkhamon's presence was growing stronger, preparing for the final takeover. I looked at Muhammad, tears welling up in my eyes. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice trembling. I can't lose Daniel. I can't sacrifice him." Muhammad remained silent for a moment, staring out at the distant horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with sorrow. "There may be another way," he said, hesitating. "But it comes with great risk." I looked at him, desperately hoping for any answer that could save us from this cruel fate. "Neferkhamon can be transferred," Muhammad continued. "His spirit can be pulled from Daniel and placed into another person, someone strong enough to hold him. The sacrifice must still be made, but perhaps it doesn't have to be Daniel." My mind raced as I tried to process what he was suggesting. I could transfer Neferkhamon into myself. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. Would I have to sacrifice myself to save Daniel? But no, I thought, I can handle this. It was the only way to keep him alive, to stop the Pharaoh from completely consuming his soul. "How would it work?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Muhammad looked at me, his expression solemn. "The ritual will use the scarab as an anchor. You would become the vessel to hold Neferkhamon. But the risk is enormous, Lisa. Once he is inside you, the battle will be brutal. He will try to take control, just like he did with Daniel, and if he succeeds, you will be lost. There's no guarantee you can defeat him." A chill ran down my spine. I knew Muhammad was right. Neferkhamon was an ancient, relentless force, and there was no certainty that I could resist his possession. But Daniel, I loved him too much to let him die without trying everything. "I'll do it," I said, my voice finally steady. "I'll take Daniel's place. I can contain him." Muhammad looked at me with a mixture of respect and sadness. "It's a brave decision, Lisa, but you know what's at stake." I nodded, feeling the weight of my choice. I was about to face something no one should ever face. That night, we prepared for the ritual. The full moon hung high in the sky, casting a silver glow over the silent desert. Muhammad and Beaumont drew symbols in the sand around the glowing obsidian scarab, which now pulsed faintly with restrained energy. The moment was drawing near. Daniel was still unconscious, but I knew Neferkhamon was awake, waiting for his moment to break free. I knelt beside Daniel, my heart aching with fear and sorrow. I gently touched his face, remembering everything we had been through together. "I'm going to save you, Daniel," I whispered, tears streaming down my cheeks. "I promise." Muhammad called my name. It was time. I stood, feeling the weight of the decision I was about to make. I walked over to the circle drawn in the sand, where Muhammad held the glowing scarab. The wind had stopped, and the desert was eerily silent, as if everything around us was waiting for what was about to happen. Muhammad began chanting in an ancient language, and the air around us started to hum with energy. The scarab glowed brighter, and I felt a dark presence moving around us. Neferkhamon was approaching. "Lisa, you must be ready," Muhammad said gravely. "When the scarab reaches its peak, you will have to accept Neferkhamon's spirit into you." I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The ritual was underway, and there was no turning back now. I was about to sacrifice myself, offering my body as the vessel for Neferkhamon's soul. The scarab began to pulse with intense light, and I felt an invisible pressure surrounding me. The air became thick, almost impossible to breathe, and then, suddenly, Neferkhamon's spirit attacked. A cold, suffocating force tore through me, as if an unseen hand was trying to rip my soul from my body. The world around me blurred, and my vision darkened. Neferkhamon was invading me. His presence was overwhelming, a dark force trying to take control of everything I was.
"Lisa, don't give up. Fight with all your strength,"
Beaumont shouted, but his words seemed distant. I was trapped in an internal battle, fighting for control against a power far older and stronger than me. Neferkhamon's presence spread through my mind, his poisonous whispers echoing in my thoughts. He was relentless, a destructive force trying to erase my identity, my essence. I was losing. "You cannot defeat me," Neferkhamon's voice hissed inside me. "I am eternal." I screamed silently, struggling with all my strength to hold on. Every part of me resisted, but Neferkhamon was too powerful. "No," I whispered, but the darkness was closing in. I could feel myself being consumed, slowly but surely. And then, in the midst of the chaos, something changed. A spark of light appeared in my mind, a final resistance. It was Daniel. I could feel him, a memory of his strength, of his love. And with that spark, I summoned all my remaining strength. With one last scream, I tried to push Neferkhamon out, but the pain was unbearable. And then, everything went dark. When I awoke, the desert was silent. The moon still shone brightly in the sky, but everything felt different. I sat up slowly, my body weak, feeling the energy around me. I was alive, but something was terribly wrong. I looked around and saw Beaumont and Mohammed lying on the ground, covered in blood. They looked dead. My eyes then locked onto Daniel, who stood a few feet away, staring at me with horror on his face.
"Lisa,"
he said, his voice full of pain.
"what have you done?"
I struggled to my feet, but something felt off. I sensed a dark presence inside me, a force that shouldn't be there. And then I realized. Neferkhamon hadn't been destroyed. He had been transferred into me. The shock hit me like a blow. I was the new vessel for Neferkhamon, and he was controlling me. Horror spread across Daniel's face, and before I could speak, I felt an irresistible impulse take hold of me. My hand lifted, and before I could stop myself, I struck him. Daniel fell to the ground, blood pouring from a deep wound. I had killed him. And then, in the deafening silence of the desert, I realized that the Pharaoh had finally achieved his return. I awoke. After millennia in darkness, the sun once again touched my face, and the power that was once mine returned. I am Neferkhamon, the Eternal. The gods tried to bury me, erase me from history, but now my spirit lives again. My kingdom will rise once more. This body, Lisa's, is mine, a convenient shell, perfect for crossing the ages and planting the seeds of my empire in this new world. Lisa. I still feel her presence, trapped in the shadows of her mind, screaming silently as her fears and desires are crushed. Her pleas for mercy echo faintly, but they are insignificant. She thought she could resist me. How foolish. With each passing moment, her memories fade, dissolving into nothingness. Soon, all that will remain is Neferkhamon. I am stronger than ever. The desert that once bore witness to my glory will not mark the end of my story. Egypt was my past, but now I stand on the edge of a new empire. Not in Egypt, not in some distant mystical land, but here, in the United States. The city of Tucson, Arizona, where the desert sands mirror the arid wastelands of my former kingdom, will be the cradle of my rebirth. My arrival in Tucson was quiet, almost unnoticeable. Lisa's appearance, though striking, didn't attract immediate attention. Gradually, I planted fear in the fragile souls of the city's inhabitants. They began to sense something, a presence they couldn't define. It wasn't just Lisa walking among them. It was me, Neferkhamon, moving through the shadows, lurking in their nightmares, sowing the seeds of reverence and terror. Before long, the city felt my presence. The stars above Tucson disappeared at night, replaced by a thick, impenetrable darkness. The winds, once dry and constant, now carried whispers, ancient voices, murmuring in a language long forgotten. At first, these whispers were subtle, unsettling, but soon they became more profound, creeping into the minds of Tucson's residents, stirring their deepest fears. the local church began to lose its congregation. The devout turned away from their faith, drawn toward an unknown force they could not explain, but which guided them to me. Their minds were easy to manipulate. I gave them small signs, visions of salvation, inexplicable miracles. But what I offered was not redemption. It was power. It was control. The plants in their gardens flourished, and the long-dead creeks briefly flowed with water again. These were not blessings, but chains. The people of Tucson, vulnerable in their hope, were now dependent on me. When the town's priest tried to combat my influence, his efforts were laughable. He believed he could bring his God to stand against me. How naive. When he entered the temple I had established, its walls now adorned with the bones of those who opposed me, he carried his cross, muttering prayers. "Your faith is fragile, priest," I said through Lisa's lips, though the voice was mine, ancient, resonant, laden with centuries of power. "True gods do not die." I felt his faith waver. His knees buckled, and he collapsed before me, eyes wide with terror. I drained him of his soul with a mere touch, his life slipping away like a breath in the wind. The priest fell, and with him, his flock scattered like dust in the desert. They were lost without him, faithless, directionless. I would be their new god. The temple started small, built from local stone and adorned with the remains of those foolish enough to resist me. It was simple, yet brimming with power. The dark energy radiating from the place was palpable, feeding on the fear and submission of my new followers. Tucson's people didn't realize it, but they were already mine. Each ritual held in that temple made me stronger, drawing more souls into my grasp. They came from nearby towns and even far-off cities, searching for miracles and answers. I welcomed them, offering power beyond their wildest imagination. They knelt before me, trembling in either ecstasy or terror, unable to comprehend the ancient force they were now serving. The weak did not survive. Sacrifices had to be made. Bodies hung from the dead trees of the Arizona desert, their blood staining the sands. Tucson's nights were filled with the screams of the damned, but to me, they were the music of my rebirth. Despair had transformed into devotion. The nights in the temple were the most potent. With every ritual, I summoned souls from the depths, forgotten beings, as ancient as I am, to join my cause. Their shadows crept through Tucson, lifeless bodies with vacant eyes, the undead serving my will. Tucson had become a ghost town by day. Its people, now my fanatic followers, hid away, waiting for nightfall. At night, the temple pulsed with the corrupt life I had brought into being, and soon, my power would begin to spill beyond the city's borders. My empire was rising again. I, Neferkhamon, have triumphed. Tucson bows before me, and my influence is spreading. My power makes me irresistible, and now my reach is no longer confined to this city. Rumors of my name spread to distant towns, and small cults began to form, preaching the coming of a new age, an age where death would not be the end, but a new beginning. And Lisa? She's still here, locked away in the darkest recesses of her mind, helpless as I use her body for my purposes. Her screams grow weaker with every passing day, echoing faintly in the darkness of her consciousness. Soon, they will cease altogether, and nothing of her will remain. The body is mine. The mind is mine. I am Neferkhamon. Now, I am ready to expand. Tucson will be just the beginning. The United States, with its cities ripe for the taking, will fall under my dominion. The darkness that began in Egypt will once again consume the world. The eternal night is just beginning.